In 1959, 12 nations signed the Antarctic Treaty in an effort to preserve the continent's unique environment. The treaty has been successful in preventing military activity and exploitation of Antarctica's resources. However, some scientists believe that the treaty is preventing important research from being conducted. They argue that the continent should be open to all nations for scientific study. Others worry that opening up Antarctica to more research would result in environmental damage. The treaty was signed in Washington, D.C. and came into effect the following year. At the time of signing, it did not appear to be a particularly significant document. However, many argue that it has had a remarkable impact on the continent itself and on international relations around the world. According to John West's article Antarctica, the Living Continent, it brought differing nations together in an unprecedented treaty to do good for the environment. Many nations had little reason to cooperate with one another at that time. By signing the Antarctic Treaty, they took a step towards cooperation and working together for a common goal. In addition, it fostered dialogue between nations on issues of climate change, pollution, and resource management. The signers of the treaty were Argentina, Australia, Belgium, Chile, France, Japan, New Zealand, Norway, South Africa, United Kingdom, United States, and USSR. Its initial objective was to create a contiguous and permanently protected area on the continent. However, it has since been expanded to include a vast range of rules that cover everything from scientific study to environmental conservation. The current treaty states that any activities by states on Antarctica must be limited to research and support of scientific study. This was a change from the initial 1959 treaty. Originally, the treaty only stated that no nation should claim any territory, mineral or otherwise. However, in 1961 Great Britain declared an area known as Crown Land and soon after claimed Antarctic rights as well. Antarctica is one of the last places to retain its pristine natural state. Almost all other continents have been affected by humans in some form or another. Throughout time, many animals and plants have become extinct or were driven to extinction because of humans' actions. Antarctica is one of the last places where we still see such pristine conditions throughout the continent. Scientific studies on Antarctica have traditionally been limited to data gathered by government-sponsored research. But despite the treaty, research has been limited as not all nations are allowed to enter the continent. There are over 50 areas within the continent that are declared to be no-go zones for governments, scientists, and expeditioners alike. These zones have been set up due to concerns about military activity or impact on fragile ecosystem. However, even with such limitations, there have been years where very little occurred in these areas of Antarctica due to lack of funding. These no-go zones also prevent important scientific studies from being done in these regions. Since coming into effect in 1959, the Antarctic Treaty has been effective at limiting military activity in Antarctica. Despite its restrictions, other countries have entered the continent illegally to conduct military activities. In 1989, China began a research station on the continent that was kept hidden from the general public. However, after just a few years, China abandoned their station because they found it to be too hard to operate. Other nations are not as reluctant to conducting military activities in the area. When the USSR disintegrated, Russia became the largest nation with territory on Antarctica. The US also bases most of its Antarctic operations out of McMurdo Station in a location that is only a few miles from New Zealand and Australia's permanent stations. The treaty has also limited scientific research as well. In 1989, two nations, France and New Zealand, sent scientists into Antarctica to test nuclear power reactors for use during a possible future expedition to Mars. Russia has been conducting studies on one of its submarines to determine if it can withstand polar conditions in preparation for modern warfare. The treaty's rules only allow researchers to conduct studies that further scientific knowledge. This restriction has made some scientists uncomfortable, and they have advocated for increased access to the continent so they can do their research. Some have even suggested that the nations of the world should make an agreement similar to the Antarctic Treaty in order to protect other parts of the globe. Many nations, including those most active in Antarctica, are becoming increasingly concerned about global warming and its effect on climate change. The Earth's temperature is rising rapidly. This has caused sea levels to increase and glaciers around the world to melt at an unprecedented rate. In fact, many governments, including the US, have set up global warming as a major threat to their security. As this threat becomes more imminent, nations around the world are pushing for increased access and research on Antarctica in order to better understand its effects on climate change. As global warming continues, it is only a matter of time until scientific discovery will no longer be sufficient enough to solve the global issue at hand. What happens next is in question. One possibility is that nations will look inward towards themselves and their fellow countries with regards to how they can prevent further climate change. Another possibility is that countries will turn to Antarctica for answers and try to find a solution there. In addition to global warming, many nations are also concerned about environmental degradation on the planet. In order to counteract such devastation and protect Antarctica, many countries have called for increased access and conference on the continent. In 1999, Britain proposed a resolution that would lead to an intergovernmental convention on Antarctica. Such an agreement would allow interested parties to discuss, coordinate, and take action in relation to the protection of the continent. However, no resolution has been passed since 1999, due in part because of concerns by countries with territory on Antarctica that they will lose sovereignty over their land if such an agreement is made. This is the end of our video of the Cold Peace Agreements. Are you into stories and would like to watch more videos on this kind of topic? Subscribe to Dtory.